The house in which this occurred followed a pattern common to many estates of its size and age, where daily order was maintained not through attention but through habit, and where objects once assigned a place remained there until inconvenience forced change. The enslaved man whose labor kept the interior moving was neither young nor old, and his position placed him close enough to the household to observe its smallest routines, yet far enough beneath notice that his presence was registered only when absent. His work carried him between kitchen, storage room, and yard, handling vessels, cleaning surfaces, and preparing what was needed before it was requested. Nothing about his movements invited comment. He had learned early that stillness and precision were safer than speed. Among the ordinary items of the household was a cup that had been in use for longer than anyone could recall. It was made of common clay, thick and uneven, its glaze dulled by years of washing. A thin fracture ran from its rim toward the base, visible only when held to the light. The crack had not yet split the vessel, and it did not leak, which was enough to spare it from replacement. Such things were judged by endurance rather than condition. When new cups arrived, they were reserved for guests or authority. Older ones circulated downward until they settled into the hands of those whose use was considered inconsequential. The cup had come to be associated with the enslaved man simply through repetition. He drank from it during meals taken standing or seated apart, refilling it from the same water source as the rest. It was returned to the same shelf after washing, placed where his hand would find it without searching. Its flaw became a subject of idle comment among overseers and younger members of the household, who found in it a harmless object upon which to rest their humor. They remarked on it in passing, calling attention to its damage with the ease reserved for things that carried no consequence. The crack was pointed out, laughed at, sometimes exaggerated, never examined. The remarks were not cruel in intention, but they were careless, and the repetition granted the object a small social role. The cup was no longer merely worn. It was familiar. Its continued presence became a quiet proof of the household's permanence, of how little change was required to maintain daily function. No one considered how long it had been used or what it had been exposed to. It was enough that it remained serviceable. The enslaved man did not respond to the remarks. He neither defended the cup nor requested another. Requests, when granted, often returned altered conditions, and he had learned to avoid drawing attention to the tools of his labor. Instead, he noted who touched the cup, when it was lifted in moments of distraction, and how authority moved through the space without looking closely at what was already there. He understood that familiarity dulled scrutiny more effectively than concealment. The house itself offered no protection against such oversight. Its kitchen was dim even at midday, its walls darkened by years of smoke. Shelves were crowded, surfaces worn smooth by countless hands. Washing was done quickly, water reused, cloths passed from one task to another. Cleanliness was measured by appearance alone. The cup washed and returned bore no visible sign of concern beyond the crack already accepted as part of it. Authority figures passed through the room without lingering. When thirst struck, they reached for what was nearest, trusting that the order of the house would serve them without thought. If the cracked cup was lifted, it was only briefly, usually set down with a remark and a smile before another vessel replaced it. No one forbade its use, no one removed it. It existed in a space beneath decision. Time moved through the household without record. Days repeated their shape. The cup remained. The remarks continued. The enslaved man's role did not change, but his awareness deepened as routine revealed its blind places. He observed how objects, once diminished in status, became invisible, and how invisibility protected them from inquiry. Nothing yet had occurred that would later draw attention, and no one present would have believed that anything worth noting was taking place. If questioned later, they would have remembered only the laughter, the crack, and the ease with which such small imperfections were ignored. What history would later lack was not evidence but interest. No ledger marked the cup. No account book mentioned its condition. The silence surrounding it was complete, not because it was hidden, but because it was too ordinary to deserve notice. And within that ordinariness, routine continued, undisturbed, carrying forward consequences that had not yet announced themselves, and whose beginnings lay quietly on a kitchen shelf, in plain view. The circulation of objects within the house followed no written order, yet it was governed by an understanding, so settled that it required no instruction. Vessels moved from shelf to table and back again, according to proximity and habit, not ownership. What belonged to the house belonged in practice to whoever reached it first. Cups, bowls, knives, and cloths were judged fit for use, so long as they did not fail outright. A chip at the rim, a loosened handle, a stain that would not lift, none of these warranted removal unless they produced inconvenience for those whose comfort mattered. The cracked cup moved through this system without resistance. Most often it remained where it had long rested, but there were moments when it drifted. During busy hours, when several hands reached at once, it might be taken by someone else, lifted without comment, then returned with a faint expression of distaste or humor. The crack itself became its defining feature, and that feature excused any disregard. It was treated as a thing already diminished, its continued presence explained by the same logic that allowed broken fences to stand and warped doors to remain uncorrected. It still served. The enslaved man handled the cup more often than anyone, not by instruction but by expectation. He washed it at the same basin as the others, though usually after the better vessels had been set aside. Water was changed infrequently. What clung to one object often passed to the next, carried invisibly by cloth and hand. This was not neglect in the mind of the household, but efficiency. Cleanliness was judged by surface alone, by what the eye could confirm without pause. He noticed, over time, how the cup was treated differently from the rest. It was scrubbed less carefully, dried more quickly, sometimes set aside damp, when other items were given more attention. No one issued these instructions. They emerged naturally from the object's lowered status. Once marked as flawed, it no longer required the same care. The enslaved man adjusted his handling accordingly, not out of disregard, but because deviation invited scrutiny. To treat the cup with unusual care would have prompted comment, and comment carried risk. Authority figures moved through these routines with practiced indifference. When thirst interrupted their work, they reached for what was nearest, assuming the house would provide without error. If the cracked cup was the closest, it might be lifted, weighed in the hand, then either used briefly or replaced with a remark. Such moments were fleeting. The object was not chosen, only encountered. Its presence was accepted as part of the house's background, no more significant than the worn floorboards or the soot-stained walls. The enslaved man observed how often such encounters occurred. He noted the times of day when attention waned, when conversation distracted, when habit overtook intention. He did not attach meaning to these observations beyond their usefulness. Knowledge of routine was a form of protection. To understand how objects moved was to understand how responsibility dissolved. No one owned the cup. No one inspected it. Its continued use depended entirely on neglect shared by all. Outside the house, similar patterns governed tools and containers used in the yard and outbuildings. Items left unattended became communal. Plants growing near paths were cut back only when they obstructed movement. Irritations, rashes, and minor ailments were common and rarely traced to source. Discomfort was accepted as part of labor and climate. Causes were assumed rather than investigated, especially when no single moment demanded explanation. The cracked cup existed comfortably within this world of assumption. Its flaw invited comment but not correction. Its use persisted because it did not yet inconvenience the wrong person. The enslaved man understood this distinction well. Objects did not disappear because they were dangerous, but because they offended authority. Until then, they remained. Days passed without incident. The cup was filled and emptied, washed and returned. Hands touched it without thought. Each use reinforced its place in the household's unexamined order. What mattered was not what the cup contained, or what clung to its surface, but that it continued to function well enough to avoid notice. In such spaces, routine protected oversight, and oversight protected routine. Nothing at this stage appeared altered. No complaint rose above the ordinary, no connection was drawn between object and effect. The house continued as it always had, trusting repetition over reflection. And within that trust, the cracked cup remained in circulation, its quiet persistence secured not by intention, but by the shared blindness of habit. The enslaved man's position within the household placed him close enough to its inner workings that patterns revealed themselves without effort. He was present when others were not attentive, and absent when attention sharpened. This allowed him to see how repetition shaped behavior, how hands reached for the same objects without thought, and how familiarity erased caution. He did not consider these observations unusual. They were simply the consequence of time spent watching rather than speaking. He learned the rhythms of the kitchen as one learns the weather, not through instruction but through endurance. Certain hours brought haste, others distraction. Morning work moved quickly, driven by the expectation of readiness. Midday introduced fatigue and impatience. Evenings softened attention altogether. Objects passed from hand to hand with less care as the day wore on, and it was during these hours that routine became most exposed. He noted this without attaching motive to it. Awareness did not require intention. The cracked cup remained a constant within these rhythms. It appeared at predictable times, returned to its place with mechanical certainty, and was handled differently depending on who was present. When authority entered the room, the cup was often ignored or mocked, then replaced. When authority was absent, it was used without comment. Its crack, once a point of humor, faded into accepted texture, like a scar on a familiar surface. The enslaved man observed how quickly even remarks grew tired, how repetition dulled even ridicule. He did not examine the cup in any deliberate way. There was no reason to. Its flaw was already known, its use established. What he noticed instead was how its condition altered the behavior around it. It was washed last. It was dried with whatever cloth was nearest. It was set down where space allowed rather than where order dictated. These were small differences, easily dismissed, but they repeated often enough to form a pattern. Patterns, he understood, were more reliable than intentions. Beyond the kitchen walls, the grounds of the estate followed similar rules. Growth along paths was cut back only when it interfered with movement. Plants considered troublesome were tolerated so long as they remained familiar. Their effects were understood through experience rather than explanation. Irritation was common, and its source was rarely sought. A rash was blamed on heat, a swelling on insects, discomfort on constitution. Remedies were habitual and imprecise, applied without certainty and abandoned without conclusion. The enslaved man had long learned that knowledge need not be spoken to be useful. Silence preserved it. He carried his observations without visible response, allowing them to settle alongside his work. He did not alter his pace or expression. His hands moved with the same practiced efficiency, his posture unchanged. Any deviation would have invited attention, and attention invited correction. Correction did not always align with survival. He noticed how authority figures trusted the house to regulate itself. They believed order persisted without maintenance, that systems once established required no further examination. This belief extended to objects, to people, and to consequences. If something functioned yesterday, it was assumed to function today. If discomfort appeared, it was attributed to chance rather than cause. The enslaved man understood that this trust was not earned but assumed, rooted in position rather than observation. Within this framework, small details gained significance precisely because they were overlooked. The cracked cup, diminished in status, passed beneath consideration. It belonged to no one of consequence, and therefore escaped inspection. The enslaved man understood that objects, like people, could exist within spaces of neglect that protected them from scrutiny. To be seen was to be corrected. To be ignored was to persist. His awareness did not carry urgency. Nothing yet demanded response. Days passed without interruption, and routine continued to shield itself. The cup was filled and emptied, returned and reused. Hands touched it, set it aside, lifted it again. No one asked whether it should remain. The question never formed because the habit was complete. If later accounts failed to capture these details, it would not be because they were hidden. They unfolded openly, with insight, governed by assumptions so deeply embedded that they rendered observation unnecessary. The enslaved man understood this without naming it. He continued his work, storing his observations quietly, knowing that time revealed more than confrontation ever could. At this stage, nothing distinguished one day from the next. The household moved forward, confident in its permanence. The cracked cup remained where it had always been, its presence unchallenged, and the enslaved man, attentive and restrained, remained within the flow of routine, observing without interruption as familiarity continued to protect what should have drawn notice, and silence preserved what history would later leave unrecorded. By the fourth stretch of days, the enslaved man understood that nothing in the household was ever truly inspected, only glanced at. Authority mistook recognition for knowledge. If a thing looked familiar, it was assumed to be harmless. If it had always been present, it was believed to be understood. This confidence did not come from care, but from habit. He noticed how discomfort, when it appeared, was discussed briefly, and then dismissed. A tightness in the chest was blamed on damp air. A burning in the throat became yesterday's meal. Even when patterns repeated, they were never connected. Each instance was treated as separate, accidental, undeserving of memory. The household had learned to forget efficiently. The enslaved man continued his tasks as expected, but his attention remained fixed on sequence rather than outcome. He observed what followed what. Which actions came before complaint, which hours preceded weakness, which hands lingered longer on certain objects. He did not interfere. Interference altered patterns. He needed them intact. The cracked cup now carried a quiet history no one bothered to track. It had been repaired once, poorly, and then abandoned to use without ceremony. Its edge caught the light differently, its surface retained residue longer than the others. It was rinsed, never scrubbed. The enslaved man noted how it was offered most often to those who arrived late, those whose presence disrupted routine just enough to be inconvenient, but not enough to be important. No one assigned the cup this role. It acquired it naturally through neglect and convenience. Objects, like people, were sorted by usefulness and burden. The cracked cup belonged to the latter category. It was tolerated, not valued. That distinction mattered. Outside the kitchen, similar logic governed the estate. Tools were used past their reliability, fences leaned until they fell. Illnesses were endured until they could no longer be ignored, at which point they were treated too late to matter. The enslaved man saw how delay functioned as a decision without appearing to be one. He understood that the household believed itself safe because it had always been so. Past survival was mistaken for future guarantee. This belief was reinforced daily by repetition. Each uneventful morning strengthened the assumption that nothing required examination. Each evening without consequence confirmed it. The enslaved man carried this understanding without expression. His face revealed nothing beyond compliance. His silence was not empty. It was deliberate. He knew that attention was a resource unevenly distributed, and those denied it learned to use what remained. By the end of this period, nothing had changed outwardly. The routines held. The cup remained in use. Complaints surfaced and faded. The household continued forward, unaware that its confidence rested not on stability, but on the absence of questioning. And the enslaved man continued to watch not with anticipation, but with certainty that systems built on assumption eventually reveal their weakness, not through force, but through the quiet accumulation of what they choose not to see. The fifth passage of time unfolded without distinction, marked only by repetition and the slow dulling of attention. In the household's records, if any existed, these days would not have warranted notation. Nothing broke. No voices were raised. Work began and ended as it always had. Yet beneath that sameness, the enslaved man observed how endurance itself was used as evidence that nothing was wrong. Authority in the house relied on endurance. If a body continued to rise in the morning, it was deemed capable. If it performed its duties without interruption, it was considered sound. Discomfort was treated as a personal weakness rather than a condition created by environment. This logic applied equally to people and to objects. A thing that had not yet failed was assumed to be adequate, regardless of strain or neglect. The cracked cup remained in circulation. Its presence was now so ordinary that it escaped notice entirely. No one commented on it. It was neither selected nor avoided with intention. It simply appeared where convenience required it. The enslaved man paid attention to when it was chosen and when it was passed over. He noticed that it followed fatigue, when hands were unsteady, when patience thinned. The cup was used without thought. Care was reserved for moments of leisure, never for moments of need. He also noted how substances were stored and transferred. Leaves brought in with other cuttings. Roots discarded near the refuse pile. Nothing was catalogued. Nothing was protected. Knowledge of use existed in fragments, passed through practice rather than instruction. The household prided itself on tradition, yet could not articulate its origins. What had once been intentional had become automatic, and what was automatic was no longer examined. The enslaved man did not need explanation. He did not require labels. He observed effects. Certain residues lingered longer when exposed to heat. Certain vessels absorbed and released differently depending on damage. He learned which surfaces retained memory and which erased it. This was not taught. It was learned through repetition and through the necessity of noticing what others did not. The authority figure at the center of the household moved through these days with increasing impatience. Small irritations accumulated, though they were dismissed aloud. Meals were criticized without appetite. Sleep was shortened, not by alarm, but by restlessness. These changes were attributed to weather, to age, to the burden of management. No connection was made between environment and condition. The idea that surroundings could influence well-being was acknowledged only in extremes. Servants adjusted quietly. Tasks were rearranged to accommodate unpredictability. Certain responsibilities were delayed, others rushed. The enslaved man watched how these adjustments were absorbed without question, how the system bent around discomfort rather than addressing its source. This bending was praised as resilience. He understood that resilience, as practiced here, was simply tolerance, stretched thin. It allowed deterioration to continue unnoticed, disguised as strength. The household believed itself adaptive because it endured, not realizing that endurance was masking gradual loss of control. The cracked cup now bore marks beyond its original flaw. The repair had loosened, its surface caught, and held what smooth vessels shed. It was cleaned less thoroughly, not out of malice, but because its roughness made complete cleaning tedious. The enslaved man noticed who avoided it instinctively, and who did not. Those with choice declined it without comment. Those without accepted it as offered. Nothing in these days suggested urgency. That absence was itself the condition that allowed continuation. The enslaved man remained precise, unremarkable, and quiet. He did not hurry. He did not pause. He allowed time to do what force never could: normalize what should have been questioned. As this period closed, the household remained confident in its routines. Confidence required no evidence beyond familiarity, and familiarity, unchallenged, continued to shield the small changes accumulating at the edges of noticed changes that required no intention to persist, only neglect. The sixth stretch of time settled into the household with a sense of quiet compression, as though the walls themselves were drawing closer without altering their shape. Nothing new was introduced, no rules were changed. The routines that governed the interior spaces continued to function as they always had, which was taken as proof of their soundness. Stability was assumed, because nothing had collapsed. Within that stability, the enslaved man noticed a narrowing of margins. Tasks that once allowed for correction now demanded completion without delay. There was less tolerance for pause, less patience for repetition. Orders were given with the expectation that they would be fulfilled immediately, though the conditions under which they were fulfilled had not improved. Time, like everything else, was expected to stretch. The authority figure spent more hours indoors. This was not framed as confinement, but as necessity. Weather was blamed when possible. When it was not, the explanation shifted to oversight, to responsibility, to the burdens of ownership. The interior rooms absorbed this presence, growing heavier with it. Air stagnated. Heat lingered. Small discomforts accumulated and were dismissed as inconsequential. Meals became irregular in quality, though not in appearance. The table remained set correctly. Portions were adequate, yet satisfaction was absent. Complaints surfaced without clear object. Taste was criticized one day and ignored the next. The enslaved man observed how dissatisfaction searched for a cause and settled on whatever was nearest, rarely on what was consistent. The cracked cup continued its quiet service. Its use now coincided with moments of distraction. When attention wandered, it appeared. When focus returned, it vanished. This pattern repeated often enough to become reliable. The enslaved man did not interfere with this rhythm. He understood that predictability required no guidance once established. He also observed the way cleaning was approached. Surfaces visible at a glance were maintained carefully. Corners and interiors received only cursory attention. The assumption was that what could not be easily seen posed no immediate concern. This belief extended beyond objects to processes, beyond processes to consequences. Visibility was treated as a measure of importance. The authority figure's discomfort became more pronounced, though still unexamined. Fatigue arrived earlier in the day. Irritability lingered longer. Decisions were postponed, then issued abruptly. The household adjusted, interpreting these changes as temperament rather than condition. This interpretation allowed responsibility to remain abstract, unassigned. The enslaved man remained attentive to small consistencies. He noted how certain symptoms appeared after particular routines, how relief followed others. These observations were never shared. They were not framed as conclusions, only as patterns worth remembering. Memory, in this context, was a form of labor performed silently. Objects in the room began to bear the marks of hurried handling. A lid set down too roughly, a cloth folded without care. None of these drew comment. Wear was expected. Decline was accepted as natural. The idea that maintenance could prevent deterioration was acknowledged in theory, but rarely practiced in detail. The cracked cup, now dulled by repeated use, blended seamlessly with the rest of the service. Its imperfection was no longer notable. It had crossed the threshold from damage to familiar. In doing so, it escaped scrutiny entirely. The enslaved man recognized this transition as significant. What was familiar no longer invited correction. As this period passed, the household's confidence remained intact. Nothing dramatic had occurred to challenge it. The quiet changes continued, unrecorded, and unremarked. Time moved forward without resistance, carrying with it the accumulated effects of inattention. And within that forward motion, the conditions necessary for consequence continued to assemble themselves, piece by ordinary piece. By the seventh passage of weeks, the household had settled into a state that felt earned rather than chosen. What had once been called order now resembled habits stripped of intention. Each person moved through their duties with the confidence of repetition, trusting that what had worked before would continue to do so without adjustment. This trust was not discussed. It existed as a shared assumption, reinforced by the absence of immediate consequence. The authority figure's presence indoors became unremarkable. What had begun as necessity had turned into preference, though it was never named as such. The rooms accommodated him as best they could. Windows were opened and closed without clear purpose. Fires were tended inconsistently. Comfort was pursued in fragments, never in full. Discomfort, when it appeared, was treated as an unavoidable aspect of authority, rather than a condition worthy of examination. The enslaved man's responsibilities expanded subtly, not through formal instruction but through omission. Tasks once shared or rotated now defaulted to him when others were occupied elsewhere. This redistribution was justified silently as efficiency. He accepted it without visible response. His movements adjusted to account for the added weight, his pace recalibrated so that nothing appeared delayed. He continued to notice the small exchanges between routine and outcome. Certain days ended with unusual lethargy in the house. On others, irritation lingered without cause. These shifts were never attributed to any single action. Instead, they were absorbed into the general character of the place, as though the house itself were responsible for its own moods. The cracked cup was now used openly without hesitation. Its presence no longer required distraction to justify it. It had become part of the ordinary service, its flaw rendered invisible by familiarity. The authority figure handled it without comment, sometimes setting it down abruptly, sometimes leaving it untouched for hours. No preference was expressed. Indifference, once established, proved durable. Cleaning continued according to appearance. What shone was praised implicitly. What did not was ignored unless it interfered with use. The enslaved man adjusted his efforts accordingly, focusing where attention lingered longest. He understood that labor was measured not by thoroughness, but by the absence of complaint. This understanding shaped every decision, every allocation of care. Conversations within the household grew shorter. Instructions were delivered with less explanation, questions answered with impatience. The assumption that everyone knew their role was reinforced by repetition, even as circumstances shifted. When misunderstandings occurred, they were treated as personal failings rather than signs of misalignment. The authority figure began to withdraw during certain hours, retreating to quieter rooms under the pretense of rest. These periods were irregular but recurring. They were spoken of lightly, as indulgence. The possibility that rest was being sought rather than chosen was not considered. Fatigue, when acknowledged at all, was framed as the cost of responsibility. The enslaved man observed these retreats with the same attentiveness he applied to tools and surfaces. He noted duration, frequency, the conditions that preceded them. These observations accumulated without forming a narrative. They existed as isolated facts, stored and recalled when needed. He did not speculate beyond what could be seen. Objects continued to bear the marks of use without care. Minor damages multiplied, none severe enough to demand repair. The household adapted around them, stepping over, working around, compensating silently. Adaptation was mistaken for resilience. The idea that adjustment might conceal deterioration was never raised. As this segment of time drew on, nothing announced itself as different. The days remained recognizable, the nights predictable, Yet within that sameness, the balance between attention and neglect continued to shift. Small decisions made without thought accumulated their effects quietly. The house held them all, unremarked, as time moved forward with the same unbroken pace. By the eighth measure of time, the household's rhythms had acquired a density that was difficult to name. Movements felt slower, not because of obstruction, but because each action now carried the residue of many similar actions before it. Nothing stood alone anymore. Every task arrived already weighted by repetition. The authority figure's routines narrowed. Meals were taken at irregular hours, sometimes delayed until irritation had already settled in. The table remained correct in its arrangement, but the atmosphere around it had grown thin. Conversation rarely extended beyond necessity. When remarks were made, they often circled the same mild grievances, voiced without expectation of remedy. Dissatisfaction had become a background condition, like heat or dampness, acknowledged only when it intensified. Physical unease appeared more frequently, though it was described vaguely: a heaviness after eating, a restlessness that made sitting uncomfortable but standing no relief. These sensations were dismissed as temporary, attributed to weather, or age, or the burdens of management. No effort was made to trace them back to routine. Routine itself was considered neutral, incapable of causing disruption simply by continuing. The enslaved man's workdays lengthened at their edges. Tasks began earlier and ended later, not by decree but by accumulation. Small requests added themselves to existing duties, each insignificant on its own. He accommodated them, without alteration to his expression. His labor remained precise, measured, attentive to detail, where detail was visible, restrained where it was not. He paid close attention to the moments when the authority figure's focus drifted. During these intervals, instructions became inconsistent. Preferences shifted without notice. What was acceptable one day drew irritation the next. The enslaved man adjusted not by questioning, but by observing. He learned which uncertainties passed without consequence, and which required immediate correction. The cracked cup remained in circulation, now so ordinary that it was handled without inspection. Its presence did not interrupt the sequence of serving or clearing. It moved from hand to table to shelf as any other object might. No one remarked on it, not even to dismiss it. Silence had replaced commentary entirely. Cleaning practices reflected the same logic. What could be confirmed at a glance was maintained. Interiors were trusted to care for themselves. The enslaved man followed this pattern precisely. He understood that deviation, even toward greater thoroughness, invited attention. Attention, in this environment, rarely brought benefit. The authority figure's retreats into private rooms became longer. Doors closed more often, not firmly, but with intention. These intervals were spoken of as necessary pauses, moments to collect thought. When he emerged, he appeared unchanged in bearing, though his patience shortened quickly. Orders were delivered abruptly, then forgotten just as fast. Other members of the household adjusted their behavior around these changes. Voices lowered, movements softened. Everyone learned to anticipate irritation and avoid it when possible. This collective adjustment was mistaken for harmony. The absence of open conflict was taken as evidence that nothing was wrong. The enslaved man observed how easily the house absorbed these shifts. Walls held sound, floors bore weight without complaint. Objects accepted handling without protest. The structure appeared resilient, capable of enduring far more than it was asked to bear. This appearance reinforced the belief that neglect carried no cost. As time continued its steady movement, the accumulation of small, unexamined choices pressed inward. No single moment demanded attention, no clear boundary was crossed, yet the conditions within the house grew increasingly specific, shaped by repetition and disregard. The consequences of this shaping remained unseen, not because they were absent, but because nothing yet required them to announce themselves. The ninth span unfolded without announcement, distinguished only by the way the household's routines began to feel slightly misaligned, as though each action arrived a fraction too late or lingered a moment too long. Nothing failed outright. Everything continued to function, which reinforced the belief that no correction was necessary. The authority figure's mornings became inconsistent. Some began with urgency, others with delay. He appeared at the table later than expected, sometimes having already eaten, sometimes waiting without explanation. This irregularity was absorbed by the household without comment. Adaptation occurred quietly, guided by habit rather than instruction. Schedules bent around his presence, then hardened again once he passed through. Physical complaints surfaced more often, though still without specificity. A lingering discomfort that interrupted sleep, a dullness that followed exertion. These were mentioned briefly, then dismissed. Remedies were not sought. The idea that such sensations might be connected to ordinary practices was never entertained. Ordinary, by definition, was assumed harmless. The enslaved man adjusted his work to accommodate these fluctuations. He learned to anticipate delay, to hold tasks in readiness without completing them too soon. This required patience more than effort. He stood with tools in hand, waiting for the moment when instruction would align with opportunity. His posture reflected readiness rather than tension, a stillness shaped by long familiarity with uncertainty. The cracked cup continued its passage through the household cycles. It was now indistinguishable from the others in function, its flaw rendered invisible by repetition. It was placed where it was needed, removed when it was not, without comment or inspection. Its continued use was not a decision, but a default, sustained by inattention. Cleaning and maintenance followed established patterns. Surfaces were wiped, floors swept, objects returned to their places. Interiors remained largely untouched. This division between what was seen and what was assumed persisted, reinforced by the absence of immediate consequence. The enslaved man adhered to these expectations precisely. He did not exceed them. Exceeding expectation invited scrutiny, meeting it ensured invisibility. The authority figure's patience shortened noticeably. Instructions were delivered with a sharpness that had not been present before, though their content remained unchanged. Corrections were issued for minor deviations, then forgotten. This inconsistency created a low, constant strain within the household, one that required continuous adjustment, but produced no clear source of complaint. Other members of the household learned to minimize interaction during certain hours. Movements became more deliberate. Speech softened. These adjustments were not coordinated. They emerged independently, shaped by shared observation. Each person acted to avoid drawing attention, mistaking caution for control. The enslaved man observed how easily discomfort was reinterpreted as temperament. Irritation was attributed to mood rather than condition. Fatigue was framed as personal weakness rather than accumulation. These interpretations allowed routine to remain unexamined. They preserved the structure of authority by locating disturbance within the individual rather than the system. Objects within the house continued to bear the quiet evidence of wear. A hinge loosened slightly, a cloth thinned at its edge. None of this prompted repair. The household adapted around these changes, compensating unconsciously. Adaptation became proof of resilience, even as it masked deterioration. As this period drew on, the house maintained its outward appearance of order. Meals were served, tasks completed, days passed without interruption. Yet within this continuity, the distance between cause and effect narrowed. Small, repeated acts continued to accumulate their influence, unobserved. Time moved forward steadily, carrying with it the weight of choices that had never been recognized as choices at all. By the 10th span of days, the rhythm of the house had settled into a kind of quiet inertia, one that masked the slow accumulation of minor disturbances. Each morning began with expectation, but carried the subtle weight of previous deviations. Tasks were completed, meals served, tools returned, but the interval between cause and effect had lengthened to a degree imperceptible to those who relied on appearances alone. The house continued to function, but not with the precision once assumed. The authority figure remained largely unaware of these subtle shifts. He moved through the interior rooms with confidence, his presence commanding but inattentive. He drank from the vessels nearest to hand, spoke without inspection, and delegated oversight to routine rather than attention. His brief frustrations, when they arose, were deflected onto minor lapses in labor, or forgotten entirely. The enslaved man noticed these patterns without intervention. Observation, in this case, was sufficient to protect both labor and person from scrutiny. The cracked cup, long a fixture of the household, continued to circulate with ease. Its flaw had become a silent signifier, marking its diminished importance. It was handled in passing, used, and set aside without comment, washed with only minimal attention, yet retained a presence so consistent it had become inseparable from the environment. Authority, habituated to inattention, never considered that what appeared ordinary might contain consequences. The enslaved man noted who avoided it instinctively, who did not, and how these minor choices were woven into the household's unnoticed equilibrium. Cleaning and maintenance adhered to form rather than function. Surfaces were wiped, floors swept, shelves dusted in visible zones, while hidden corners received only cursory attention. Objects displayed the effects of repeated handling, their imperfections normalized through neglect. The enslaved man performed these tasks precisely, measuring effort to align with visibility and expectation. Any divergence, even toward thoroughness, risked comment. Routine in this case dictated safety. The authority figure's disposition continued to fluctuate. Rest periods extended into late hours, and irritability surfaced with increasing frequency. These changes were attributed to stress, the burden of management, or trivial circumstance. No consideration was given to cumulative conditions within the environment, or to the effects of repeated, unnoticed exposure. Minor ailments were noted, then dismissed. Discomforts passed without cause being sought. The enslaved man saw the patterns, storing them quietly, knowing that recognition without action could have consequences only in their own time. Other members of the household adjusted around these subtle shifts. Movements became more deliberate, speech more measured. Anticipation replaced spontaneity. These adjustments were instinctive, uncoordinated, yet collectively reinforced the household's sense of order. Each person acted as though they alone bore responsibility for accommodating imperfection, unaware that the aggregate of these small accommodations shaped the environment itself. The house itself responded to time and attention or lack thereof. Objects shifted imperceptibly in placement, surfaces darkened slightly, tools worn by repeated handling. Even the walls seemed to absorb the inertia, holding it quietly, as if the building itself understood the slow accrual of neglect. This endurance was mistaken for resilience, yet it concealed fragility that had yet to manifest. The enslaved man observed how minor discomforts emerged and receded. Certain vessels retained residues longer, certain surfaces absorbed heat or moisture differently. These observations remained private, catalogued in memory rather than speech. His restraint was not obedience, nor was it fear. It was a method of engagement, allowing him to navigate patterns without inviting interference. Within this continuity, the subtle shifts accumulated. No single moment demanded intervention. No sudden incident disrupted routine, yet each day reinforced the connection between inattention and consequence. By the close of this period, the house appeared unchanged, the authority figure unchanged, the tasks unchanged, but the conditions for disruption had quietly multiplied, resting in the cracks of familiarity and the spaces overlooked, ready to assert themselves in time yet unperceived in the present. By the 11th passage of time, the weight of repetition had begun to press more insistently on the household, though no one outside its walls would have noticed. Each day seemed to carry the same outward-shaped meals served, tools returned, fires tended, but beneath this continuity, small deviations were accumulating, and the enslaved man observed them with an attentiveness born of necessity. He did not intervene. His role was to adapt, to note, and to endure. The authority figure moved through the rooms with habitual confidence, yet certain details began to escape him. Cups were set aside too quickly, fires left to smolder, cloths folded carelessly. None of these lapses were recognized as significant, and none were remarked upon. The enslaved man saw how authority mistook inattention for competence, and how reliance on routine had created a false sense of control. Each omission passed into normalcy, quietly reshaping expectations. The cracked cup, unremarkable in its function, now carried with it a subtle distinction. It was no longer merely flawed. It had become an object whose imperfection was invisible, whose continuity relied entirely on the shared indifference of the household. It was used at irregular intervals, yet never removed, never replaced. It existed in a liminal space, where durability and neglect coincided. The enslaved man noted who handled it deliberately and who did not, mapping the flow of attention and avoidance through silent observation. Work in the kitchen, the yard, and the storage rooms followed this pattern. Tasks were completed with exacting care only when they would be seen. Hidden surfaces, containers, and utensils received minimal attention, their condition left to the mercy of habit. The enslaved man performed all duties with the same disciplined precision, aware that deviation even toward improvement might attract scrutiny. He learned which acts of restraint preserved invisibility and which would invite examination. The authority figure's temperament fluctuated more noticeably. Small irritations surfaced with greater frequency. Instructions were issued sharply, then rescinded or forgotten. Meals were consumed with distraction rather than appetite. Complaints were fleeting, and explanations were rarely sought. These minor dislocations produced no consequence in the immediate sense, yet they shifted the household's dynamics subtly, altering behavior through anticipation rather than coercion. Other members of the household adapted instinctively. Movements softened, voices were lowered, and decisions deferred until conditions seemed stable. These adaptations were unspoken, but collectively enforced a fragile equilibrium. What appeared orderly was in fact the result of continuous unseen negotiation, a balance maintained through restraint, caution, and observation. The enslaved man catalogued patterns with quiet precision. He tracked the intervals between use and neglect, between remark and silence, between attention and oversight. These were not conclusions or plans. They were a form of mental mapping, an understanding of causality and absence. He understood that consequences need not be immediate to exist. They could accumulate quietly, revealed only in time. Objects continued to bear the evidence of repeated handling. Surfaces darkened, cloths frayed, vessels retained faint residues. Nothing demanded attention, and yet all were affected. Adaptation to imperfection had become routine, shaping the household as surely as the hands that moved within it. By the close of this period, nothing had erupted, nothing had broken. Yet the accumulation of small lapses, repeated choices, and unnoticed shifts in routine had begun to form the conditions for consequence. The house carried them silently. The authority figure remained unaware, and the enslaved man observed, restrained and patient, knowing that the unseen effects of repetition were as inevitable as the passage of time itself. By the 12th passage of time, the house had grown quieter in ways that were almost imperceptible, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the rhythm of oversight and neglect. The repetition of tasks, the habitual attention to some things and dismissal of others, created a steady hum beneath the surface of daily life, an unspoken order that required no announcement. What had once been oversight had now become expectation, and what was expected required little thought. The authority figure moved through this environment with habitual confidence, assuming stability where none had been tested. His morning routines were uneven, his attention brief and inconsistent. Meals were consumed without scrutiny, minor discomforts acknowledged and discarded as inconsequential. In moments of fatigue or irritation, he relied on the presumption that routine would suffice to maintain order, the enslaved man observed, noting how reliance on habit reinforced blind trust, and how each unexamined act widened the gap between attention and effect. The cracked cup, silent and unremarkable, continued its role in the household cycles. Its flaw was no longer noticed, having been normalized by repetition. It was lifted, filled, emptied, and washed without comment. Its persistence was ensured entirely by collective neglect. No one thought it significant, no one questioned its use, and yet it remained in circulation, an invisible constant. The enslaved man took note of how others avoided or accepted it, mapping the contours of indifference in silence. Labor unfolded with careful attention only where oversight was certain. Surfaces visible to the authority figure were scrubbed and polished. Those beyond sight remained untouched. Tools, utensils, and containers bore the marks of repeated use, fraying and staining in ways that went unnoticed. The enslaved man moved through these tasks without haste or exaggeration, calibrated precisely to expectation. Restraint was not merely prudent, it was protection. The authority figure's irritability became a recurring presence, though it never erupted into confrontation. Orders were issued sharply, then disregarded. Minor complaints punctuated the day, fading as quickly as they appeared. These fluctuations, though minor, required continuous adjustment from the household. The enslaved man observed each shift, storing them as knowledge without imparting concern. He understood that the impact of small, repeated disruptions would accumulate long before they became visible. Other members of the household responded instinctively. Movement slowed, voices softened, decisions were deferred until conditions seemed stable. Their behavior was uncoordinated, but collectively reinforced a fragile equilibrium. The house maintained a veneer of order, yet beneath it, the interplay of neglect, oversight, and habitual adjustment created a space in which consequence could gestate unseen. Objects continued to reveal the effects of repeated handling. Stains persisted, cloths thinned, surfaces dulled. Each imperfection accumulated quietly, unnoticed by those who assumed continuity equaled stability. The enslaved man recognized the significance of these small details, not for immediate effect, but for the slow, inevitable shaping of the environment. By the close of this period, the household remained outwardly unchanged. Tasks were completed, meals served, and appearances maintained. Yet the unseen forces, the repeated, unremarked acts, the subtle shifts in behavior, the accumulation of neglect, were assembling conditions that would eventually demand acknowledgement. The house carried these conditions silently. The authority figure remained unaware, and the enslaved man observed with a calm knowledge that the quiet persistence of routine could shape outcomes far more effectively than sudden action ever could. By the 13th passage of time, a subtle rigidity had settled over the household. The routines were so ingrained that each movement, each exchange, seemed automatic, performed with a precision that required little conscious thought. Yet within this apparent order, the enslaved man observed fissures forming, invisible to the untrained eye. The slight hesitation before a cup was lifted, the way cloths were folded without care in hidden corners, the barely noticeable adjustment of a tool's position after use. The authority figure's presence had become predictable in its unpredictability. He moved through the rooms with habitual entitlement, his attention fleeting, his gestures measured yet inattentive. When he spoke, it was with the assumption that instructions were understood without confirmation. Complaints or irritations were brief and unexamined, and his retreats to private rooms grew longer and more frequent. Each withdrawal left the household to its own devices, and each return altered the rhythm of labor in ways no one explicitly recorded. The cracked cup persisted, unremarkable and unquestioned, yet its significance had quietly shifted. It no longer drew attention simply because it was overlooked. It had become a vessel of constancy, the silent marker of continuity amidst imperfection. The enslaved man noted the patterns of its use, who reached for it without hesitation, who avoided it instinctively, who left it untouched until necessity demanded. These observations were catalogued internally, their significance held in patience rather than action. Labor continued along familiar lines. Surfaces, tools, and containers showed cumulative wear, darkened stains, frayed edges, dulled surfaces. The enslaved man's hands moved with deliberate care where visibility demanded it, and with efficiency where scrutiny was absent. Each motion was calculated to maintain invisibility while preserving precision, to ensure that routine endured without provoking interruption. Restraint had become a form of agency, allowing observation to flourish within a system that would punish excess attention. The authority figure's irritability persisted, manifesting in brief, sharp instructions, followed by indifference. Fatigue and distraction intertwined in unpredictable ways, shaping the flow of the household without acknowledgement. The enslaved man watched these fluctuations closely, noting which habits could be relied upon and which were subject to the caprice of attention. He understood that patterns mattered more than isolated incidents, and that consequence often followed in the silent spaces between action and awareness. Other household members adjusted instinctively, softening movements and speech to accommodate subtle shifts in routine. These adaptations were unspoken, unconscious, yet collectively maintained a fragile equilibrium. What appeared as calm order was in fact an ongoing negotiation, mediated by observation and adherence to habit. The enslaved man in his silence traced these currents of behavior with precision, understanding their impact without acting on them. Objects, long accustomed to repeated use, had acquired a quiet testimony of neglect. The cracked cup, the frayed cloths, the dulled surfaces all bore the marks of repeated handling, yet none commanded attention. The household's perception of continuity obscured the slow accrual of small alterations. Adaptation disguised degradation. By the end of this period, nothing seemed to have changed. Meals were served, tasks completed, surfaces attended. The authority figure remained unaware. The household members moved in their muted coordination, and the enslaved man observed in stillness. Yet beneath this surface, a subtle accumulation of overlooked details, unattended imperfections, and habitual neglect continued to assemble the conditions for consequence. Time moved forward, carrying with it the quiet inevitability of the changes that no one had yet recognized, and the tension of what was poised but unmanifested lingered in every shadowed corner. By the 14th passage of time, the household had reached a state that seemed stable only because no one paused long enough to notice its slow unraveling. The rhythm of labor, of meals, of attention had become self-reinforcing. Each action followed the last, as if guided by an invisible hand, yet the hand belonged not to authority, but to neglect itself. Every repeated gesture, every habitual omission pressed imperceptibly against the household's fragile continuity. The authority figure moved through the interior with a confidence that had hardened into assumption. He believed that stability persisted because of his presence rather than in spite of it. Irritability surfaced more frequently, yet each sharp remark passed without real consequence. Requests were issued with an expectation of obedience, but the conditions surrounding their fulfillment were overlooked. The enslaved man observed each moment, noting how patterns of fatigue, distraction, and oversight interwove seamlessly into the household's flow. The cracked cup remained in circulation, unchanged in function yet transformed in significance. Its flaw was invisible, not only because of repetition, but because indifference had given it endurance. Those who handled it did so without thought. Those who avoided it did so instinctively. Its presence marked continuity more than attention, and the enslaved man tracked these subtle interactions carefully, cataloging the flow of neglect and habit without raising suspicion. Work unfolded along established lines. Surfaces and utensils bore the quiet testimony of repeated handling: frayed edges, dulled surfaces, faint residues. Cleaning remained focused on what was visible, leaving hidden areas largely unattended. The enslaved man's movements were precise, efficient, restrained. Every motion was calculated to preserve the invisibility of both himself and the small changes he observed. He had learned that silence, patience, and constancy allowed him to navigate the household without provoking scrutiny. The authority figure's irritability produced subtle disruptions rather than overt crises. Instructions arrived abruptly, then dissipated into inattention. Small mistakes were corrected with minimal notice. Fatigue and distraction appeared as character rather than consequence, and the enslaved man watched with a quiet understanding that the accumulation of small lapses could carry impact far beyond immediate perception. Other household members adjusted instinctively. Movements became deliberate, speech muted. Decisions were deferred until conditions seemed secure. These adjustments were unspoken, yet collectively reinforced the fragile equilibrium. What appeared as calm order was a continuous negotiation mediated by habit, attention, and observation. Objects continued to record the effects of repeated use. The cracked cup, frayed cloths, dulled surfaces, all were shaped by neglect and habit, yet the household perceived only continuity. Adaptation disguised deterioration. Each day reinforced the sense that nothing required attention, that all was as it should be, while the underlying fragility of routine deepened. As this period drew to a close, the stage was set for consequence, though none had yet emerged. The authority figure remained unaware. Household members moved in muted coordination, and the enslaved man continued his observation with careful patience. The accumulation of small, unremarked acts, neglect, distraction, habitual oversight pressing quietly against order, was now poised to reveal itself. Time carried forward, indifferent to recognition, and the subtle tension that had been building for weeks lingered in every corner, ready to assert itself when least expected. By the 15th and final passage, the household had become a vessel of quiet tension, each corner and surface holding the residue of weeks, months, perhaps years of unnoticed accumulation. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Meals were prepared and served. Tools returned to their places. Fires tended and extinguished. Yet within that apparent continuity, subtle shifts had stacked upon one another, forming an invisible lattice that no eye but the most observant could perceive. The authority figure continued to move through the interior rooms with habitual entitlement, unaware that his confidence rested upon assumptions rather than knowledge. His attention remained brief, his actions dictated more by habit than intention. Fatigue and irritability appeared and vanished without explanation. Instructions were issued, sometimes ignored, sometimes misinterpreted, and then forgotten as quickly as they were delivered. Nothing in these lapses registered to him as consequential. The system of routine itself seemed sufficient to maintain control. The enslaved man observed with the calm precision of one who had long understood the household's rhythms. He moved with careful attention, measured gestures, and a restraint that concealed the depth of his awareness. The cracked cup continued to circulate, unremarkable in its use, yet laden with quiet significance. It marked continuity, the persistence of imperfection tolerated without notice. Its flaw was invisible, yet the enslaved man knew that it had become a silent instrument in the architecture of routine and neglect. Labor unfolded as it always had. though the invisible weight of past lapses now shaped every moment. Surfaces showed the faint imprint of repeated handling, cloths frayed, utensils dulled, objects darkened with residue. Cleaning was performed precisely where scrutiny demanded it, and efficiently where it did not. Every gesture was calculated to maintain invisibility while sustaining the household's function. The enslaved man had learned that silence and consistency were more powerful than overt action, that attention preserved what authority ignored. Other household members moved cautiously, instinctively, adjusting to the subtle dissonances that permeated the air. Movements softened, speech became measured, choices deferred. The balance of the house relied not on instruction, but on the unspoken adaptation of those who inhabited it. Calm appeared outwardly, yet it was supported entirely by the invisible labor of observation and patience. The authority figure's presence remained commanding yet inattentive. Irritation surfaced and passed, consequences accumulated without recognition, and the assumption of order persisted. The enslaved man tracked these fluctuations meticulously, understanding that each repetition, each small oversight, was a stitch in the pattern that would eventually assert itself. By the close of this period, the quiet tension reached its zenith. The conditions of consequence, neglect, habitual oversight, unexamined repetition, and the persistence of unnoticed flaws had fully assembled. Nothing had broken. No one had acted overtly, yet the household was no longer what it had appeared to be. The lattice of minor, accumulated disruptions had matured into a structure capable of revealing impact without immediate signal. The authority figure remained unaware. The household continued its muted coordination, and the enslaved man observed, patient and restrained, knowing that the inevitability of consequence was suspended, poised, and ready to assert itself in the silence that had carried it forward all along.